It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. We have an opportunity this morning to talk with someone who served both on the Trump-Iran negotiating team and also under President Biden as Director for Iran at the National Security Council. It's Nate Swanson, who is now sharing his views as an independent observer of the U.S.-Iran war, as Director of the Iran Strategy Project at the think tank the Atlantic Council. And here's the context for his latest article and the news of the last 2 days. President Trump made headlines he didn't want to make, we talked about this yesterday, when he said this about the impact of the war on Americans' finances.
The only thing that matters when I'm talking about Iran, they can't have a nuclear weapon. I don't think about Americans' financial situation. I don't think about anybody. I think about one thing.
One thing, nuclear weapons. So, okay, he's asking the country to be okay with the economic pain the war is causing because the goal of ridding Iran of its nuclear program is that important to the U.S. and the world. But here's what he said just on April 30th after the first phase of the war.
If we didn't go in and do what we did, we obliterated that nuclear capacity of theirs. And so they didn't get the nuclear bomb.
They didn't get their nuclear bomb. So you can be forgiven for being confused about whether Iran's nuclear program has been obliterated, which Trump has said many times, that word, or we should all be understanding of the inflation he's causing because it's worth it to stop the nuclear program. More? Again? And interestingly, on Trump's trip to China underway right now, the only two things he and Xi Jinping officially agreed about so far in the statements they released is that Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon and the Strait of Hormuz should be open without a toll. So let's try to make sense of this with Nate Swanson, who again served both on the Trump-Iran negotiating team and also under President Biden as Director for Iran at the National Security Council. It's he is now sharing his views once again as an independent observer of the U.S.-Iran war, as Director of the Iran Strategy Project at the think tank the Atlantic Council, and he has a new article in the publication Foreign Affairs that says Washington has more demands, but Tehran has more leverage. Nate, thanks for coming on for this. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you for having me.
Can I start on some of this news from the Trump-Xi Jinping summit in Beijing?
Sure.
They couldn't agree on Taiwan. They couldn't agree on trade. They don't agree on which of them is the big dog, but they agreed that Iran shouldn't have nuclear weapons. Why would China say that? The earlier reports I've seen say China is helping Iran militarily in the war.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a very controversial statement for China to make, and it's been one that they've been making, for decades. The nuance here is, though, that the Iranian foreign minister went to Iran, I believe he went to China 8 days ago, and the Chinese, ended the meeting by saying, of course, Iran has the right to enrich. All right, so it's like a nuanced position that doesn't match Trump's, but everyone agrees, that Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon.
We'll come back to the summit and how it might change the course of the war and the nuclear negotiations. But about those two contradictory clips of Trump that I played, has Iran's nuclear program been obliterated? Or if not, why would he say that in the context of the ongoing war?
Well, look, it's hard to parse Trump's statements, which are contradictory. And so, I'm not even going to try to do that. But the fact is that the program was set back quite a bit by the strikes last June, but it still remains a very latent and real threat. They still have, these highly enriched uranium, 440 kilograms around the country, and they still, and more importantly, and this is the point of the article we wrote, have this better know-how that's really advanced in the last 7 or 8 years since the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, to the point that if they wanted to actually go for a nuclear weapon, they're actually quite well positioned to do that, even with the strikes that happened last year.
Right. So he said obliterated last year, too, after the 12-day war that the U.S. and Israel undertook against Iran, primarily to get at the nuclear program. Your article goes into detail about what the intelligence shows was or wasn't actually accomplished when Trump said they obliterated the program last year. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, We use this analogy in the article that if you think about Iran and their pursuit of a nuclear weapon, it's kind of like a person running around a track. And so what what the JCPOA did in 2015 is it basically halted Iran's progress in place at the time. So we say if Iran could walk around the track, they could do it. It would take a year. But that's what the implication was. So between the time that Iran tried to between the time the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA and the run up to last year's attack, but basically Iran learned how to sprint, and so the time frame for them to complete that same distance was frighteningly short, days, weeks, very short if they want to go for a weapon. Trump has set back the starting point with the strikes, but they still know how to sprint essentially, and so even if they started from scratch. The time and even if Iran agreed to Trump's demands of no enrichment, no stockpiles, the time it would take them to develop a weapon is basically half, maybe 6 months or so, maybe 7, which is half the value of what the JC provided in 2015. And so our argument is that this is no longer the measure for how we should evaluate a nuclear deal. But it's funny because that's what Trump has decided. He's decided to measure it by enrichment and stockpiles, which is just not a valid measure anymore.
And you write that even if Iran accepts Trump's demand for zero enrichment and gives up its stockpiles of highly enriched uranium, more severe constraints than the JCPOA, the Obama deal, included, it might still be able to finish the race to develop a bomb in less time. How could that be?
Well, so I wrote this article with my friend and colleague from the State Department and White House, Matthew Sharp. Basically, the point, and Matthew's the nuclear scientist in this group, not me, but basically the point is they've learned to install better centrifuges faster. So the centrifuges are basically 6 times the quality they used to be in 2015, and they can do it at 3 times the rate. And so that is essentially why it's happened, and that that led us to our argument that you should focus on other issues. But that's the problem we now face today. Is that, Iran is just more capable of doing these things.
And so you wrote that any new deal should also include detailed procedures to allow inspectors to understand Iran's current nuclear capabilities and to prevent Iran from making covert progress toward a weapon. Can you talk about the idea of covert progress? This is one of the most interesting things to me of your article. This is all over your article. And I came away with the impression that Iran was cheating on the Obama deal by covert actions, and you think they'll try to cheat again under any new agreement with Trump. Am I understanding that right?
Not quite. So they weren't cheating under the Obama deal, but they cheated in the run-up to the Obama deal, right? So they clandestinely developed these 2 nuclear sites, Fordo and Isfahan, and only after they were publicly revealed, once by an exile group and once by the U.S., did Iran come clean. So they were covertly developing these programs in the run-up to the deal, and in the deal itself, they weren't cheating as far as I'm aware, or I think anyone's aware. But the problem is you don't know what you don't know. So you basically need a future deal to have 2 things that are not being discussed now. The first is that basically the way to get at this covert aspect is to monitor the centrifuges that are being produced by Iran. And so this is something the JCPOA did have. And basically it's quite simple concept is that, Iran, if every centrifuge is going made, you know the end use, right? So if they make something and it's not where they said, you have extreme doubts about what's happening. So it's just the best way to try to get at the covert angle. And yes, Iran could, covertly make centrifuges, but these are big facilities, and so you'd have to hide both the manufacturing place and the place where they're doing centrifuges. So that was the first thing we said that needed to be addressed, and that's fairly simple, and that was kind of done in the JCPOA. The second thing that wasn't really done in the JCPOA, and as you referenced, is this idea of trying to measure Iran's weaponization efforts, because this is something that doesn't happen in a big warehouse, right? This is computer modeling. This is kind of what could look like dual use research. And so because the timeline is so much shorter, you really need a lot more on this. And this is really hard because this means going into universities, military sites, and basically getting full assurances that Iran's not doing some kind of nuclear weapons program, a covert program. And so that is a very hard ask. But if, frankly, in this current environment, is necessary to have like a meaningful and sustainable Iran deal. And so that is really what our article comes down to. And so that's a very big ask in the moment.
My guest is Nate Swanson. If you're just joining us from the think tank, the Atlantic Council, these days he's been an Iran negotiator under President Trump and an Iran specialist under President Biden. And his new article on Foreign Affairs is about the nuclear program that is supposedly at the heart of the negotiations and the standoff. You know what I want to ask you? Why should we care so much about this entire topic, if you even think we should? I mean, a good number of countries have nuclear weapons, but nobody has used one since World War II, because the consequences for all parties involved would be presumably so dire, right? What they call mutual assured destruction. Mm-hmm. So why would this even be a high priority for all these sacrifices of U.S. lives and Americans' financial pain, not to mention everybody else that's getting killed in this war, if you think it should?
Yeah, so let me answer that with a couple things. First of all, I mean, it is kind of an odd frame that Trump has made the negotiations about a nuclear deal when the war, itself had very little to do with Iran's nuclear program. This one, he talked about regime change. He talked about the military degradation. He talked about, picking the new supreme leader. It was nothing to do with the nuclear program, but now in the end game, he's defining it that way. So, I don't think the war was ever about Iran's nuclear program. So it's bizarre framing. But I think that said, this is an argument that my co-author and I have been having for basically, 10, 11 years. We were both in the Obama administration helping implement the JCPOA. And there's a recognition from that time that, as useful as the constraints on Iran's nuclear program as they were, it wasn't sufficient for the broader problem. There would have to be a follow-on deal. And so we've had this debate really for a decade about, well, okay, you need to have, you need to constrain Iran's nuclear program, because if you don't, all the other problems we have with Iran get worse, right? We have deep issues with their, basically their foreign policy towards us, which is, hostile towards the Gulf and hostile towards Israel. And by having a nuclear weapon, all of those problems just get worse. So basically, we've been having this argument for a decade. And the reason we decided to write this article is we kind of realized, I was advocating for, a wider scope, something that addresses the full reach of Iran's problems with us. And he was saying we need better nuclear constraints. And I think basically the war showed we're both right, because the more time goes on, the problem doesn't get better, it gets worse. And so you need to address the nuclear program, but it's also not solely sufficient for addressing the broader Iran problem. So and there's not a military solution. So you do need to ultimately address this. You need to address it diplomatically. And the more time that goes on, the problem only gets worse. So ultimately, that is, I think, the strongest argument for caring about the nuclear program, because if they have a nuclear weapon, all the other bad things they do get infinitely worse. And so that's why I think we ultimately argue that, you do need this follow-on nuclear deal, because if not, it's just too big of a threat to regional security and our own interests.
So back to where we started to wrap this up, the Trump-Xi Jinping summit in Beijing, which is still going on. Various reports say China is offering to help pressure Iran to make a deal in exchange for things China wants from the United States on trade and Taiwan and other things. Do you have any sense of how far China is willing to go to draw a line on how much Iran has to give up its nuclear program in the ways you've written would be meaningful?
I have very low hopes that China will push hard. I think, it's easy for China to rhetorically say Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon because they agree with that. Pushing for the meaningful constraints, I don't see China doing. The one area where I do see overlap with the U.S. is both the U.S. and China want an open Strait of Hormuz. And so to that extent, I think China could be helpful on the broader Iran, or at least not harmful on the broader Iran issue. But on the nuclear program, I don't see them ultimately pushing for a meaningful deal, right? I mean, you've had multiple opportunities throughout, Biden, Obama, Trump won to push Iran on this, and they don't. And it's not really a priority for them. So I don't see them their joint statement today or their separate statements today being anything other than a rhetorical flourish. But I do hold out some hope that they might help on the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, last question then. Iran has leverage over China because China gets so much of its oil from Iran. What leverage does China have over Iran when Iran is basically holding the oil hostage through the Strait of Hormuz closure?
A ton. I mean, Iran is, almost fully dependent on China ultimately to buy their oil. It's somewhere between 80 and 90%. And whereas, China is Iran's number one trading partner, I don't remember the exact number, but, it's like 70 or 80 for China, right? I mean, and China has just as big of interest with the UAE and Saudi, as they do with Iran. So, I mean, I do think China holds considerable sway over Iran, much more so than Iran does vice versa. But I just don't think they're motivated to use it. I think they'd rather just see us flounder.
Nate Swanson, who served both on the Trump-Iran negotiating team and also under President Biden as director for Iran at the National Security Council, and as he just said, under President Obama as well. He's now sharing his views as an independent observer of the U.S.-Iran war, as director of the Iran Strategy Project at the think tank The Atlantic Council, and his latest article in the publication Foreign Affairs is about this topic. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you for having me.